What I want to do to begin with today is just to indicate some general features of critical realist philosophy, so that you'll be a little bit prepared for the more systematic discussion, which I'll also start this morning. And today will be mainly about the basics of critical realism, and then tomorrow, as Trond was saying, we'll go into some newer developments. So what I want to do right now is to list 6 general features of critical realist philosophy, which I think differentiates them from other philosophical approaches. And I will say them all first before saying a few words about each. So the first feature is philosophical underlaboring. And then the second feature would be seriousness. And the third would be immanent critique. The fourth, the idea of philosophy is explicating presuppositions. The fifth would be transformed practice. And the sixth I'll call the principle of hermeticism. So the idea of philosophical underlaboring, I can introduce this by reading you a quote from John Locke, who said, "The commonwealth of learning is not at this time without master builders, whose mighty designs in advancing the sciences will leave lasting monuments to the admiration of posterity. But everyone must not hope to be a Boyle or a Sydenham, and in an age that produces such masters as the great Eugenius and the incomparable Mr. Newton, with some others of that strain, it is ambition enough to be employed as an underlabourer in clearing the ground a little and removing some of the rubbish that lies in the way to knowledge." Well, that is really what critical realism is trying to do. It's not trying to produce an account of the world which will compete with that of science or that of everyday life. What it's trying to do is to clear the ground from, get rid of ideological and other obstacles that prevent good science and a good ordinary life. This is an important thing to appreciate about critical realism. And now the second feature is also distinctive of critical realism. This is seriousness. And what I mean by seriousness is the unity of theory and practice. Now, a lot of philosophy is not serious. The philosophy that I studied at Oxford University as an undergraduate was not serious. A lot of the time, we were asked to do things like essays, which we would read to our tutor, and the essay would be, does another person exist? Basically, the answer is obvious. And there are a lot of important philosophical questions where the answer isn't obvious. And those are serious enterprises. But of course, philosophers give answers which aren't serious. To give you an example of an answer which isn't serious, I'll take David Hume, the great British empiricist. And Hume said, for instance, you cannot give a better reason for going out of a room on the second floor by the second floor window, going out of a room on the second floor by the ground floor exit than by the second floor window. In other words, he was saying that, we might as well go out by the second floor window. But if that was the case, we have to ask, why did Hume always leave buildings by the ground floor exit? Why didn't he actually go out by the second floor window? Well, the reason is because he had a reason. He had a reason which wasn't expressed in his answer, and the reason was his knowledge of the force of gravity. But for epistemological reasons, he didn't want to regard gravity as something that could be a reason for doing anything. And so he came up with this skeptical quote. Now, I'll give you another instance of unseriousness on the part of Hume. From the moral realm, he said, there's no better reason to prefer the destruction of my little finger to that of the whole world. Now, and this is extraordinary, if you can't give a better reason to prefer the destruction of your little finger to the whole world, then we would have to say that philosophy had reached a very sorry state. But of course, this wasn't a serious remark. And if he'd been thinking about it seriously, then he would have seen that if the whole world is destroyed, then the whole world must include his little finger. So, you know, there's clearly a better reason, you know, which is you save the rest of the world. You lose your finger either way, but in the case of preferring the destruction of it, you only lose your little finger. So what he was actually doing was extrapolating, hypostatizing philosophy from the world. And this is something that philosophers are often prone to do, not understanding themselves as part of the world. And this, of course, is what a lot of academics do, including academic social scientists. They talk about society as something out there, as if society wasn't also in here, in our discourse, in our interactions. The idea of critical realism is to produce a philosophy that you can live by or act on. It's to do something, produce a philosophy that's going to be practically relevant in underlaboring for the sciences and the social sciences and other practices, such as the practice of human emancipation. Now, the third feature that I'm going to briefly talk about is the idea of immanent critique, because there's a question of how you criticize a view that you don't agree with. Now, the immanent critique says what you've got to do if you disagree with someone is find something within their own framework, a value or belief which you can latch on to and show that the belief you object to is inconsistent with that value or belief. And in that way, you can bring them around. Now, clearly, immanent critique is the only way you can actually convince someone of the incorrectness of their position. So it's saying don't just say what you believe, look at what other people believe, and if you disagree with it, then you have to do it in an immanently critical way. So I might be critical of empiricism or neo-Kantianism or social constructionism. What I've got to do is find something that they say, something within their framework of beliefs, and show that it's wrong in their terms. And the fourth feature of critical realist philosophy takes us into what philosophy is about. So, for me, what philosophy does is it analyzes or explicates the presuppositions of our activities, presuppositions which we take for granted and which are normally not reflected on. Everything that we say has presuppositions. If I talk about an event, that has presuppositions. I might say, what is this event? I might say, did you go to my lecture this morning, or my discussion this morning? And so that has a certain presupposition. Now, if I was to ask you, well, if that's an event, how many events are going on here? Well, you wouldn't really know what to say. Where would you begin? Would you count as an event a sentence that I utter? Or would it be just articulating a sound? Or would it be a whole passage? Or would it be the discussion itself this morning? Or perhaps it's only part of an event. We don't know because we haven't explicated the presuppositions of that. Now, if I asked you how many things were there in the room, can anyone give me an answer? Well, you would start by counting people, wouldn't you? But then, do you count tables and chairs? And then, what about the atoms and electrons that constituted them? You wouldn't know where to begin or end. So the idea is that activities like science, or even particular parts of science, like theory building or experimentation, have presuppositions. And what philosophy tries to do is showing what these activities presuppose about the world. So that's the idea of presuppositions. Now, the fifth idea is that it should have some sort of implications for your practice. And as you will see, if you don't already know, critical realism is very critical, not of natural science itself, but of our understanding, philosophical understanding of science in empiricism, Kantianism, Popperianism, etc., etc. So where the critical realist is trying to do is to say, well, okay, what you're doing in science is fine, but our understanding of science needs to be improved a lot. And that's bringing the theory into line with the practice. Now, of course, in the social sciences, there's a big dispute about what is a good practice. Perhaps in the natural sciences, there isn't, but in social science, there is. And here, what philosophy can hope to do is actually show a better practice. So, in the case of the philosophy of the natural sciences, you might be transforming theory. In the case of the social sciences, hopefully, you'll be helping to transform practice itself. And then, in line with this idea of seriousness and that goal for philosophy of transforming our understanding or our practice, critical realism also is something that you can apply to your own life and experience. And what I'd like you to do today in the lunch break and when you go home is think whether you can actually use it in some way. If we're talking about the world being structured or differentiated, what difference does that make? What difference does that make in your life? If I'm talking about a particular way in which you explain events, then test it. This is the principle of hermeticism. Test it, see if it makes sense to ordinary events. And if it doesn't, come back and tell me there's something wrong with it. Or there's something wrong with your understanding of it. And we can work out which. So do try and apply it tonight. Now, obviously, most of you are doing research projects. So the first thing you might try and apply it to is your research project. but I want you to apply it to ordinary events in your life as well. Okay, so those are 6 differentiating features of critical realist philosophy. Now I want to tell you a little bit about how I came to it. I was a graduate student in Oxford University, and I thought I had done as my undergraduate degree, philosophy, politics, and economics. I think I was, Stephen, is it? Yeah. I was chatting to Stephen about that. And I really didn't know which of these subjects was more interesting or important. But then I thought about it, and I thought, well, clearly economics. This was, we're talking about the late 1960s. Clearly economics is the most important of these. And I was particularly concerned about problems of poverty in the third world and questions of development. And so I started a thesis project on the relevance of economic theory for underdeveloped countries. And I was very keen on this topic, and I had excellent supervisors, but I very soon discovered that it was a hopeless project, because in economics, what you couldn't do was you couldn't compare a body of theory and the world. Milton Friedman and others had argued there is no way in which you could talk about the relevance or the realism of economic theory. What you have to do, what you have in the case of economics, is you have a set of axioms, and the more uninterpreted those axioms are, the better, and you trace the consequences of it. And you don't talk about, the world at all. So this is still within economics, and a sort of accepted doctrine that you can't compare economics and the world. So I thought this was very unsatisfactory, because it was obvious to me that there were certain assumptions within economics that were not true of the world. So I went back and read textbooks on the philosophy of science and philosophy of social science. And in the philosophy of science, for example, I found a lot of discourse about explanation and confirmation and falsification and you name it. But there was nothing about the world. And so then I thought, well, this is very strange. So I went back to philosophy, and I looked, at the philosophy of Kant and the philosophy of Hume. The chief apostles of empiricism and Kantianism or neo-Kantianism, and there I saw it, and it was stated, "Thou shalt not do ontology." In other words, don't talk about the world. You can't say anything about the world in itself. And so that doctrine, I'm going to try and speak in a very simple way. So for those of you who don't know, ontology is the philosophical study of being, or reality, or the world. And it's normally contrasted with epistemology, which is the philosophical study of knowledge. So I realized that I would have to do something about this. How the world was a crucially important factor that contemporary philosophy was largely ignoring. Now, if you looked at the actual theories put forward by philosophy of science, rather like the theories put forward by economics, but we'll leave economics on one side. You can see that what the underlying arch theory was the Humean theory of causal laws. And this theory of causal laws says that causal other laws and other objects of scientific understanding are constant conjunctions of atomistic events, empirical regularities. And what does this presuppose about the world? You know, well, if whenever you get something, you always get the same effect. That presupposes, and that's all you can say about the world, that presupposes that the world is flat. It's got no structure. It presupposes that the world is undifferentiated. What happens in this room is the same as what happens in Oslo, is the same as what happens in New Delhi. So there's no differentiation. And above all, if what happens here always happens, then there's no change. So the world that was presupposed by the Humean theory of causal laws was undifferentiated, unstructured, and unchanging. And it was clear to me that this wasn't true about the world. So this set the initial terms for what then became basic critical realism. I suppose it started with my book, which was, I changed my thesis topic and started writing philosophy. And it was clear that I had to do two things. First, because ontology, or philosophical discourse about being, had been ruled out of court by Hume and Kant, I had to show that ontology was possible and necessary. That was the first task. And the second task was I had to show that the implicit ontology of existing philosophy of science was false. And that what you needed was a new ontology. And my new ontology would at least incorporate the principles of structure, of difference, and of change. Now, how could I do this? I had to, consistently with the axiom of immanent critique, I had to find something to latch on to within existing philosophy. So what I latched on to was, above all, the practice of experimental activity. Because all philosophers, I'm talking about standard or mainstream, philosophers of the natural sciences, agreed that experiments were important. They agreed that experience was important. But the experience they really meant was experimental experience. And so I did an analysis of experimental activity. I also did an analysis of applied activity, and I got the same results. So what it was apparent from the analysis of experimental activity was that a causal law, which you were able to identify and empirically test claims about under experimental conditions, couldn't be an empirical regularity, because you only got these empirical regularities in the laboratory. But what your work in the laboratory enabled you to talk about in the natural sciences was things that existed and acted outside the laboratory. So you did an experiment to test something, say test gravity, and you got a set of results which wouldn't have been replicated empirically outside the laboratory. That's why you had to do it in the laboratory. But what it was giving you access to was a law about gravity which operated and existed and acted outside the laboratory. So let's just think about this. The law of gravity is operating on me now. even though I'm not falling to the ground, and neither are you, because there are counteracting structures. But we're still subject to gravity. So this was the crucial argument that showed that there had to be a difference between laws and empirical regularities. Laws had to relate to something more than empirical regularities. And the more they related to, I argued, was the activity of structures or generative mechanisms which were only testable under closed conditions in the laboratory. So now let me retrace my steps a little bit. So the argument for ontology and the argument for new ontology were one and the same. But the argument for ontology, I was talking about now the world, something that was true of the world, as distinct from our knowledge. The world had to include structures and mechanisms which generated sequences, empirical sequences of events. And this allowed me to say that you can talk about the world as it is, independently of our human experience. And I argued that to think your way clearly here, you had to critique what I call the epistemic fallacy, which was the reduction of being to knowledge. And you had to understand science and other cognitive activities in terms of two dimensions, what I call the transitive dimension of science, or knowledge production, and an intransitive dimension of the world, which you were trying to understand or study. It's pretty obvious that science is a social process, and that scientific theories are fallible, they're produced by human beings, they're constructions of human beings, but what they give you knowledge of is a world that exists and acts independently of human beings. So this was from the argument for ontology, we have a distinction between knowledge and being, or between epistemology and ontology, or between what I call the transitive dimension and the intransitive dimension. And you have from this the critique of the epistemic fallacy. Now, turning to the other argument or sub-argument, the argument for the new ontology. What the argument that I informally summarized to you about experiments made use of was a distinction between, on the one hand, structures and events, and on the other hand, laboratory conditions, or more generally, closed systems and open systems. And the whole of basic critical realism really follows, from the distinction between open and closed systems and what I call the domain of the real and the domain of the actual. The domain, more fully, I differentiated three domains: the domain of the real, the domain of the actual, and the domain of the empirical. Now, the domain of the real includes the actual and the empirical. But the important thing is that the real also includes generative mechanisms and structures which aren't actual, but which produce actual results. And similarly, the domain of the actual includes the empirical, but also includes events and things that no one perceives. And so the experience is a limiting case. We have experience, we have events and things in the world, and then we have the structures and generative mechanisms that produce them. what I criticized was the collapse of the real to the actual and to the empirical that you get in doctrines like the Humean theory of causal laws. The idea that a causal law or some other object of scientific understanding is, to all intents and purposes, can be understood as an empirical regularity. This informs an awful lot of our contemporary philosophy of research practice of science, and it's completely wrong. What the scientist is trying to do is to understand not the pattern of events, but what produces it. This, of course, gives you an entirely new view of science and the world itself. If you read empiricism, if you read Kantianism, if you read standard philosophy of science or social science, you would never guess that science could be an activity which was exciting, which was fun, which told you something new about the world, because you're supposed to, it's just a gloss on empirical regularities, the repetitions in your experience. But of course, science is about something unknown, something wonderful. So we have a new vision of science, and aligned with this new vision of the world, a world which includes depth and structure to it, as well as the surface. And then we can reread the history of science, and we can see the history of science as a repeated investigation of ever more recondite and deep structures. So that reality is not just structured once, it has a multi-tiered stratification. So I'll give you an example. This is a table here, and it has a definite material structure, but this material structure is kept in place by the movement of molecules, which is a deep level of reality compared with this surface structure. And that reality of molecules is kept in structure, in place, by the reality of the atoms, chemical bonding and valency. And the reality of the atoms is kept in place by the electrons. And electrons are kept in place by quarks or unified fields, or the great theory of everything, whatever you want to believe. So we have a reality as a multi-tiered stratification. And what you can do is you can work out a certain logic to science on the basis of this understanding of the world as being stratified and differentiated, and also subject to change. And the logic of scientific discovery that critical realism puts forward goes like this. Now, I'm going to use initials, so D, R, E, I, C. So the first, what you do in science is you try and find a non-random pattern in nature, or perhaps there's one which has been experimentally generated. And this is description. You describe what happens on the surface. That is the D for description. And the next step is we call retroduction. And this is you imagine plausible or possible, that plausible to begin with, generative mechanisms or structures which, if they were real, would generate the phenomena in question. So this is called retroduction. And then that's the D, we've got the D and the R, and then the next step is the E. Clearly, you can, in principle, generate, using your creative imagination, more than one possible generative mechanism. So what you've got to do is, and in general, of course, in science, it's good to have a multiplicity. What you've got to do is eliminate those which aren't correct. And how do you do this? Well, you experimentally test their consequences, say, or in some other way, you have to eliminate it. And then comes, after the DRE, the I. And this is a wonderful point where you can actually see or empirically identify what it is that generates the phenomena. So you get to the point where you can see, those are molecules, moving around, and this is the I of identification. And in general, there are two empirical tests. You can either see something or observe it or using your senses, or perhaps you won't be able to observe it, but you can identify its effects, as in the case of a magnetic field. You can't see a magnetic field, but you can observe its effects on other things, which you can observe. So now we've moved to a new level of reality. The reality, from the reality of tables to the reality of molecules. What do we do when we get to this new reality? Well, we do two things. First of all, we'll discover that a lot of our results need to be revised. So this is the DREIC, that's correction of achieved results. But the more important thing that we do also is we, of course, describe that level. We want to see how things behave at that level. And we start, in effect, a new round of discovery, because what we'll be doing is we'll be doing exhaustive description of behavior at that level, and then we'll reproduce possible explanatory mechanisms and structures, and then we'll eliminate those which are inadequate, and we'll eventually get to a point where we can identify what caused the cause of where we initially started. In other words, we'll get to a deeper level of reality, which might be the level, in this case, of atoms. And you go on in science from, in increasing depth. So we will come back, hopefully later this morning, to look at, in particular, what's wrong with the leading theoretical ideologies in the philosophy of social science, including empiricism and Kantianism. But for the moment, I want to focus on this logic of scientific discovery. Now, the key element is an understanding of reality as being stratified. And so we have to differentiate three senses of the stratification of reality. And the three senses are firstly the simple sense, in which you have structures and mechanisms generating the phenomena that you're investigating. That's the sense of the distinction between the domain of the real and the actual. And then the second sense is the multi-tiered stratification of reality. The way this process and that distinction is repeated again and again in the history of science. And then the third form of a sense of stratification takes us into new territory. And after this, we'll stop for a coffee break. And this new territory is, the third form of stratification is emergence. And emergence may be best introduced by using an example of an emergent domain or an emergent level of structure. And the simplest example to pick on is the structure of mind. So mind is emergent from body. Now, let me give an example of this. So, Lena, there, can I ask you, Lena, to raise your right arm? Right, okay. So she's raised her right arm. Now, you see, this is an example of an emergent level of causation, because in raising her right arm, this was not something that was determined by her neurophysiology. This was something she did intentionally in response to my request. It illustrates the operation of an emergent level. Now, before we break up for coffee or tea, what I want to do is list 3 criteria for emergence. When you've got an emergent domain like that, these 3 criteria must apply. And the first is the unilateral dependence of the emergent or higher order level, in this case mind or intentionality, from the lower order level, in this case body or neurophysiology. So you don't get mind where you don't have body. That's what it means. The unilateral dependence of mind on body. And then the second criterion is taxonomic irreducibility, that we cannot explain what happens at the emergent level solely by reference to the lower order level. I can't explain what Lena did by referring to neurophysiology. The neurophysiology must be there, but it doesn't explain why she moved her arm. So that is taxonomic irreducibility. And then the third criterion is very important, and this is causal irreducibility. And this says that the higher order or emergent level is causally efficacious in the domain of the lower order level, because what she did was a bodily movement. If Erin is there, or Trond is there, and if I said, Trond, I'm feeling a bit cold here, will you go and get my jersey, my coat? And he goes and gets my coat and brings it back. So there'll be a whole sequence of steps that he goes through, and physical movements, and the coat, which was in his car, is no longer in his car. And all intentional action, all action at the higher order level, actually proceeds in that way. When we do something intentionally, we always move something or make a difference in the physical world. I'm uttering intentional sentences to you, and I'm producing sound waves, which are affecting you or not affecting you. And so this is, of course, what happens with climate change, but it's also what happens with industry, agriculture, and it happens with everything we do physically. We bring about changes in the physical world as a result of higher order or emergent causality, a causality that cannot be understood by reference to the lower order level from which it emerged. So is this a good time to have a break? So after the break, we'll come back and see what implications this new account of science and being has for the social sciences. Thank you.
So we see 10 minutes?
So will you come back in 10 minutes? 10 minutes.